From the Missouri School of Journalism, welcome to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. The Uyghur people of the Western Chinese province of Xinjiang have long had an uneasy relationship with Beijing. The Uyghurs are a Turkic people and are mostly Muslim, and that's long led to concerns within China's Communist Party about their loyalty to the central government. But over the past year, China appears to have greatly stepped up repression of its roughly 13 million Uyghurs. As many as 1 million of them have been forced into detention camps that some call political re-education centers. According to a recent report from Human Rights Watch, inside the camps, the Uyghurs are forced to learn Mandarin Chinese, sing songs praising communism, and are punished for practicing Islam. In many cases, the Uyghurs have been detained for crimes like growing their beards too long or wearing a face veil. China has denied that it has detained so many Uyghurs or discriminated against them, though it has said that it faces threats in Xinjiang from Islamic militants. The government also says that only those who have committed serious crimes are imprisoned, and suggested that the detention camps are vocational schools where people may be sent to study. So on this edition of Global Journalist, a look at the situation for China's Uyghur minority, a group that human rights organizations warn is the target of a massive effort by the Chinese state to eliminate their culture and religion. Now, in a few minutes, we'll hear from a panel of guests who have been following this issue closely. First, we're going to bring in Ilshat Hassan. He's the president of the Uyghur American Association and has family members in Xinjiang. Ilshat, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Well, as I mentioned, you have contacts with many people in Xinjiang now. Tell us the stories of just one or two of them that illustrate what's happening there.
Just tell you my personal story. I have a brother. He was killed after I left my hometown. He was killed in 2014, 27th of November, by a group of Chinese mob in a restaurant in the early morning breakfast time for no reason. And I have three sisters. My elder sister was detained because of my human rights work in 2014, 17th of August. My father, because of this ordeal in all my family happened, and he passed away 2015. And since 2016, June, I had called my mother last time, and she is begging me, don't call her again, because of my phone call created all trouble for her and also for all family members. And so since then, I lost contact with my mother, with my sister. Actually, with my sister and the other relative was earlier than that. And since the 2016, the last phone call with my mother, I tried to contact her again and I tried to find her information. She's disappeared, and the sisters and the brother-in-law and my uncle, all of them disappeared. It's
so it
like
sounds
a black hole.
It sounds like you mentioned, I'm sorry to hear that your brother was killed in an ethnic riot a couple years ago, but then also
Yes.
you have had other family members targeted by the local government because of your activism in the United States.
Yes, sir.
Well,
That's the...
Well, if I could, I mean, you were born and raised in Xinjiang. You lived there for many years. What kind of challenges do Uyghurs face just in everyday life?
In everyday life, we have facing the open discrimination, whether it's in job or in public space or in others, whatever it is, you can name it. And for example, I was teacher for 15 years. I teach chemical and Chinese language to Uyghur students and also to Chinese students. And in a job fair, I brought all my students. Their majority is Uyghur and Kazakh. And in the job fair, I went to a company asking them if they're interested in my students. They have skills, what they are required. And the factory boss told me, he is a Chinese lady, she told me, no, we don't hire any minority. And I asked her, why? this is Uyghur Autonomous Region. It is in the constitution of the Chinese law and also the regional autonomous law. You should hire all minority in priority. And she told me, we don't hire. If you want to complain, go anywhere to complain. That's the daily we are facing. Even as a teacher, I am facing, and also the student facing. Difficult in the...
So it sounds like even in Xinjiang, a part of China where Uyghurs make up a significant portion of the population, there's open discrimination against them for jobs, for schooling, for other sort of civic goods.
Yes, sir. That's exactly. Daily, we are having this discrimination. Even when you are going to the police station, for the birth certificate, for the passport, everything. Uyghur is asking more question and sometimes detained because simply you are asking the same requirement as the Chinese, but because you are Uyghur, you were denied.
Well, the Chinese government says it faces threats from Islamic extremists. It points out that there are some Uyghurs that have fought in Afghanistan, that have joined the Islamic State, and that this is a justification for this current campaign. What's your response to that?
The Chinese government never provided any hard evidence for that. And for the Uyghur to join whatever the jihadist or radical Islamism, it needed to be a free society. Uyghur facing three kinds of restriction. One is personal movement. Uyghur is the hardest people to can get the passport. Second, Uyghurs cannot go to online freely. They were restricted. No any Uyghur internet was allowed freely. And the second, no any Uyghurs publication or something can be freely disseminated. So Uyghurs have no any information regarding the outside world. I mean, generally, Uyghur cannot connect with outside world freely, like the Chinese or other peoples. So the Chinese claim is without evidence. They are just claiming it.
Well, it does sound like it's a very isolated part of China, and our time grows short. But before we leave you, I wanted to ask you as well, this issue was raised at the United Nations in August and has received a bit of attention from the international media in the past month or two. Has anything changed in Xinjiang as a result of this?
No, nothing changed. It was intensifying, and the Chinese, in the beginning, regarding the more than 1 million Uyghur was held in the concentration camp, and they denied it. After that, they tried to disguise it, hide it, and then now, yesterday, the Chinese officially, in their legal system, they were introduced a legal subject, which is legalizing the education, the indoctrination of the Uyghur as a vocational training school.
So in other words, you know, from previously denying the existence of these types of centers, they acknowledge them on some level recently. But I'm sorry, Ilshat, we're out of time. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
This is Global Journalist. On today's program, we're talking about China's ethnic Uyghur minority. By some estimates, as many as 1 million of the region's 14 million Uyghurs have been sent to political re-education centers as part of a Chinese effort to control its Muslim minority. Now, to broaden our discussion, we're going to bring in three other guests. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is James Millward. He's a historian who studies China and Central Asia at Georgetown University. James, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Also with us is Adrian Zenz. He researches Western China at the European School of Culture and Theology in Korntal, Germany, but he joins us today from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Adrian, welcome.
Thank you and good morning.
And on the line from Terre Haute, Indiana is Tim Gross. He's an assistant professor of Chinese studies at the Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology. Tim, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, Jim Millward, if I could start with you. We heard Ilshat Kokbori describe some of the repressive measures happening in Xinjiang. His group is obviously opposed to the Chinese government. Is what he describes, is it consistent with your own research, with what you know about what's happening in Xinjiang?
Yeah, yes, it is. They're not exaggerating any of that at all. And I might sort of want to add one point to what Ilshat said. these kind of crackdowns and restrictions on sort of everyday practice of Islam, everyday expression of Uyghur culture, they've really been going on and ratcheting up since the early 1990s. And at the same time, the Chinese government has been ratcheting up its claims that the dangers of separatism and the dangers of Islamic extremism have been getting worse and worse. And one thing they don't do is ever even consider, at least publicly, that their own policies might be related to the tensions in Xinjiang.
Well, Adrian Zenz, let me turn this to you. Is it really possible that there are 1 million people being held in these re-education camps? That number, it just seems so, it's huge.
It is indeed. Now, of course, there is no official statistics. Any number estimate is inherently speculative. However, in the years between 2014 and 16, especially, the Xinjiang government was quite straightforward in publishing fairly detailed documentation on the structure of this emerging re-education camp system. We then have a range of other government documentation that has emerged since, such as procurement construction bids that indicate that these camps have been established on all kinds of administrative levels, from village to township to county to prefecture. Now, if you combine this with reports that people are missing, especially men, that streets are empty, bazaars are empty, many houses and shops are boarded up, I think it's very likely that we are looking at a higher range estimate of those who have been detained and disappearing. You cannot speak to any Uyghur without them saying that many close family members and many more from extended family networks have been detained. So, in my opinion, it is not unfeasible to think that 1 million or more have been detained in these camps.
Well, Tim Groves, if I could turn this to you, what do we know about what happens inside these, well, we heard Ilshat Kokbori call them concentration camps. Others are calling them re-education camps. What takes place there?
And actually I want to add to Adrian's insightful comments that the so-called target population, the Zhongjian Renkou, who seem to be most at risk of being detained, are in some cities as many as 30%. And so I think that that might be a high, but these are coming from government documents.
So as much as 30% of the target population, which is mostly young men, is that right?
Yeah, born in the 80s and 90s, religiously devout, also with connections abroad. So, you know, some cities have designated 30% of the population as falling under this label, as, again, this targeted population. And so if cities have upwards of 30% of the population as being so-called target population, it is feasible that as many as 1 million people have been detained. Now, what goes on in these re-education centers? Well, it's a very regimented routine. Their mornings, the entire day has been essentially prescripted for them. From breakfast until dinner, they have re-education classes, ideological kind of drills. They also have to sing patriotic songs, sing patriotic cadences, march in place. They're subjected to videos that will identify the so-called illegal and legal religious activities, etc.
Well, Jim Millward, if you could talk to us about what is sort of the Chinese government's big picture strategy in doing this. I mean, we're talking about certainly hundreds of thousands, possibly more than 1 million people being forced into these political re-education centers, these concentration camps for some period of time. What is their end game?
Yeah, let me just add one thing to what Tim was saying quickly. So we have these accounts of the, I guess, standard curriculum, if you want to use that word, of what happens in these camps. And there's a range from people who can go in and come back in the same day and are subjected to this kind of propaganda, and then people who are stuck there indefinitely. But we also have firsthand accounts from some people who've gotten out and gone to Kazakhstan and been able to talk, for example, of real physical hardship and physical tortures even. That some people have been subjected to, probably for resisting, the kinds of trainings and so on that's going on. So it really runs the gamut from, so-called vocational training or re-education to real, to torture, really. And the big question is, with 1 million people in there and all these different camps, we really don't know what's going on. Now, I'm sorry, could you repeat your...
Yeah, no, I was just going to ask you what
yeah.
the government's big picture strategy is in doing this. What's the end game for the government?
Well, this is the question, because first of all, they denied that they existed. They mentioned, sort of vocational training, and there's propaganda about, teaching people skills and teaching them, patriotism. It's bewildering to most foreign observers to think that locking up huge percentages of an ethnic population for a long period of time, indefinitely, taking them away from their families, putting their kids into orphanages, how could that possibly serve a function of making them happier citizens, right? But I think the Chinese thinking on this sort of goes back to Confucian and even Maoist ideas of a kind of ritual conversion therapy. And I think the goal is that they're going to sort of educate and train and, to use the old-fashioned word, brainwash separatism and religious thinking out of people. And this is, in one aspect of this is that it's part of a broader move by Xi Jinping. We're seeing pictures of President Xi Jinping now. A broader move to sinify religion. He sees, religion as another kind of thought system that is anathema to the kind of Chinese patriotism that he wants to implement. And so, broadly speaking, Islam is a competitive system of thought that the Chinese Communist Party now is trying to assimilate out of people.
Well, Adrian said Jim raises some interesting points there, particularly about Islam, because it does seem like the government is being very active in trying to control and discourage Uyghurs from practicing Islam. Talk to us about how they're doing that.
Yes, now, of course, Islam in particular has been considered a threat by the Chinese, not just because of extremism, but essentially any organized foreign religion, in particularly Islam and also Christianity, is increasingly considered a threat in China to the dominance of communist ideological rule. Now, in Xinjiang at the moment, it is really quite unclear which aspect of everyday normal Islam is still acceptable and legal to practice. People have had to surrender the government-sanctioned translation of the Quran. We're not just talking about some unauthorized foreign translations. We're talking the government-sanctioned translation.
So even just a translation of the Quran that the government itself has provided for people to have is now considered illegal.
That's absolutely true. Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Continue. Talk to us about some of the other restrictions.
Yes, prayer mats have to be surrendered. Any religious symbols. There's also a war on the halal food practice, or on any halal practice for that matter. There's also, if you want to say, kind of a battle against the Arabic script. Even the very use of the Arabic script is considered suspect. And of course, as you may have noticed, there's a real push to marginalize the Uyghur language or minority languages, and to educate citizens in Chinese from preschool. As early as preschool, kids are now being put into schools where it is not allowed to speak the Uyghur language, even outside the classroom. They're supposed to be in a full immersion environment where they learn the Chinese language. And that also is part of a battle against what they perceive the influence of religious ideology, which is being now fought from all kinds of aspects and angles.
Could I jump in with just one sort of extreme example that really points to what's going on? We've seen photographs that have gone around on Twitter of a restaurant. It was a Uyghur restaurant, and its original name had one of the syllables was the word moon in it, I in Uyghur. And we've seen that the signage has taken that word off. They pulled those letters off of the sign, because the moon, of course, is part of the moon and crescent Islamic symbol, and someone either felt it was a good idea or was told that they needed to get the moon out of the name of their restaurant. That's the degree to which this kind of cultural sensitivity or persecution has gone.
A reminder that you're tuned into Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. On today's program, we're talking about China's stepped-up repression of its Uyghur minority. According to the Wall Street Journal, China has doubled the number of detention camps in the western province of Xinjiang over the past year. As many as 1 million Uyghurs may be held in them. If you're interested in more Global Journalists, check us out online at globaljournalist.org. There you can find our archives and additional coverage of underreported international news and human rights issues. You can also like us on Facebook, where we live stream, follow us on Twitter, subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, or see our videocast on YouTube. Tim Groves, if I could turn this to you. We heard Adrian Zenz and Jim Millward talking about some of the restrictions on Islam. I know that you've done a fair amount of research, especially, and I don't want to focus too much on the food issue, but I do think it's an excellent symbol on eating pork and encouraging Uyghurs to eat pork, which of course is not allowed by Islam.
Right. So certainly, Uighurs, as well as the vast majority of all practicing Muslims will avoid the consumption of pork because of Islamic dietary laws. There has been in recent years not so much forcing Uighurs to eat pork, though there are some anecdotes that suggest that's going on, but a kind of a more subtle movement to at least have Uighurs entertain the possibility of first dining with Han colleagues and friends in specifically Han-owned restaurants, and then even trying. So these wouldn't be
halal restaurants, as Adrian mentioned, those that have been sanctioned by a religious authority.
Correct. Yeah. So it's the kind of official encouraging of Uighurs to share meals with Han in Han-defined spaces, and so of course there are programs right now in Xinjiang where it's mandatory to have essentially Han visitors into your home to share meals, to work together, to chat, get to know each other, etc. But again, they're taking this one step further, and they're changing the environment in which these interactions occur. So they're no longer in a Uyghur home, but outside. And they've even gone as far as pointing to quote-unquote scientific evidence that suggests at the molecular level there's no difference between pork and lamb. And so if there's no difference at the molecular level, then it has to be a social construct. And therefore, they should be more flexible with their food taboos.
Well, Jim Millward, if we could just turn this a little bit to the problem of access to this area. Now, how easy is it for outsiders, for independent reporters, for researchers like yourself to get information about what's happening inside Xinjiang?
Well, of course, it's not easy, and for the last over a decade, it's been more and more problematic for foreign scholars to get in and visas to do research. One of the problems we have, just knowing how Uyghur people feel, and I actually think the Chinese government has a similar problem, is that it's impossible to do sociological surveys there under the sort of current situation, whether you're a foreign scholar or even a Chinese scholar. And there's also something of a news vacuum. But I think part of the story here actually is one of remarkable reporting by foreign reporters, remarkable work by scholars like Adrian or Tim, just looking on the web, finding government documents and also to materials that are right there if you know how to look. Even satellite photography, Google Earth has revealed the scale and the expansion of the camps. And so I think there was the Chinese government, I think, did not really realize how much of this information is really right out there in plain sight. And of course, the scale of what's going on is so huge, it's impossible to hide.
Well, Adrian, if I could turn this to you, one of the interesting aspects of this to me is that the level of surveillance in Xinjiang just seems extraordinary. I mean, this is a fairly poor part of China, but it sounds like the efforts to use different technological tracking devices, human spies, basically, to track people's movements and what they're doing is remarkable. Talk to us about that.
Now, even though Xinjiang has been a poorer and lesser developed province, as you have said, their spending on security has absolutely skyrocketed, and they're spending more per capita, far more per capita than the average in China, even than some of the coastal cities. It's been very common now for even smaller county towns in Xinjiang, in these Muslim majority regions, to install very comprehensive electronic surveillance systems, whereby you would have cameras throughout the city at every intersection, in many, many locations. And of course, you have many checkpoints. Thousands of new police stations have been built. And all of this information is being fed into one huge database that's being systematically analyzed. In some cases, what you have is that at checkpoints, you are being checked, your cell phone is being checked. And if the intelligence system is flagging anything about you, and this is often now based on so-called artificial intelligence in the context of predictive policing, whereby there's a statistical test to see if you are doing anything out of the ordinary, if you have any suspicious background of any kind. This could be just even completely normal behavior. Then you are liable to be questioned and you could be detained.
And let me add with what Adrian said, that the line that defines what abnormal activity or what might be suspicious behavior is constantly shifting. And so that puts, I think, every Uighur on edge. They're constantly surveilling or monitoring and having, assessing themselves of whether or not that they're doing would be considered abnormal, and then thus, have them sent to a re-education center. So this line isn't in any way, shape, or form clear to the people who are have to constantly navigate it.
Well, Jim Millward, our time grows short. I mean, the Chinese government has justified some of these security measures on security grounds and says that it faces a threat from terrorism there. I mean, is this well-founded, or is this just kind of a fig leaf to crack down on what may be, sort of ordinary dissent?
It is true that there were a relatively small number of Uyghurs joining with groups in Syria and Afghanistan. In part, that's arguably the result of earlier policies, which has driven people out. Some very good reporting has shown that it's kind of young men showing up in Turkey with nothing to do who got recruited into Al-Nusra Front and some of these groups. I think domestically, though, within China, within Xinjiang, there's very little threat of large-scale or organized, terrorist activity, what we would call terrorist activity. There is no organized movement within Xinjiang. It's been so thoroughly cracked down upon for decades now that there's no room for that. What there has been over the last few years is a small number of terrorist incidents, that is violence against civilians, in 2013 through 2014 or so. And then probably quite a bit more of dissent or unrest, sort of civil unrest against the authorities that most Western observers would not call terrorism, but rather reactions to local local policies. So from the Chinese point of view, this is all insecurity. They call everything terrorism. So that's what they're concerned about. But there's certainly no threat to overall stability in Xinjiang. There's no existential threat to China's control over Xinjiang. There's no real threat even to its foreign policy initiative of the Belt and Road coming from the Uyghurs. So their response is excessive and indiscriminate, and that's the problem with it.
Well, Jim, I'm sorry, we're out of time for this edition of Global Journalist, a production of the Reynolds Journalism Institute at the Missouri School of Journalism and KBIA, Mid-Missouri Public Radio. Many thanks to Ilshad Hassan, Jim Millward, Adrian Zenz, and Tim Groves for joining us. For all of us at Global Journalist, I'm Jason McClure. Thanks for tuning in.